Before we begin, I gotta say something to you. Not as a commentator, but me, the person. With the amount of effort, scripting, and brainpower that goes into these videos, you could at least do me the courtesy of sharing them around so they can at least get a measly 1,000 views or so, unless you think you can do better. Obviously, that's just a bit of minor foreshadowing in the form of some hyperbole, but I think it's going to illustrate the point of this episode really, really well. Mic the board, please. I am very pleased to report that we have reached the point of this season of Rick and Morty where we have a hyper self-aware episode that gives some good commentary relevant to the modern day. But before we get into all of that, I would just like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for getting this channel to 15,000 subscribers. If you asked me what I did to deserve this kind of attention, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but I will tell you to keep hitting that like and sub button if you've been enjoying my coverage of Rick and Morty Season 8 thus far, and definitely be sure to check out my previous reviews about all the previous episodes on the season if you haven't already. But without any further delay, let us talk about Rick and Morty Season 8 Episode 7 starring James Gunn and Zach Snyder. I'm serious. The episode opens with Rick, Morty, and Jerry watching the 9th installment of Maximum Velocity, which is like a mock/parody of big superhero action films. Rick makes some comments and remarks about how he barely even understands what's happening in this movie anymore, and Morty wholeheartedly agrees with him. Morty also expresses his annoyance with how the token comic relief character is reintroducing the main cast in the 9th movie. Why? Why do you need to reintroduce the main cast? It's the 9th movie. While Rick and Morty are very disappointed that the heroes once again let the villain get away, Jerry expresses that, you know, he enjoyed the film. He actually kind of enjoyed it. Only for Rick to take away that small moment of happiness by pissing on the television. Rick doesn't know what to do with all these feelings, all these horrible feelings of his favorite franchise being ruined. And Morty makes the suggestion, you know, maybe it's time to like something else. Maybe it's time to get into something else. If you're a modern day Marvel fan, I'm sure you've heard or said that to another Marvel fan before. But Rick isn't having it, and he decides to portal directly into James Gunn's office. Not only does Rick completely decimate an entire desk carved by Bradley Cooper, that must have been expensive. It's clear that this whole scene and interaction between Rick and James Gunn is a representation of overly aggressive and toxic movie fans who do have some valid points, but they just express them in a very toxic, angry, and non-constructive fashion.
Stop eating up screen time with stupid comic relief characters and put more cool shit in the story!
And the thing is, I actually agree with Rick here. I think a lot of modern day action superhero movies and just movies and mainstream movies in general don't spend enough time on actually like narratively interesting plot points and decide to just give it all to comic relief characters, because why not? Funny, haha, Marvel humor. And in doing so, they burn up all this screen time on all these throwaway characters, and it just doesn't contribute very much to the story. But before you scold me and say, it's a lot harder than it looks to balance comedy and narrative, I retort, Sokka from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Let's move on. James Gunn explains to Rick that he too is in fact a fan. And he also explains how writing movies and making movies in general isn't easy. Hell, the next installment of Maximum Velocity has had 40 rewrites. 40! I really like this part of the scene because it's both mocking and genuinely highlighting one of the biggest issues in the mainstream film industry at the moment. So many movies and TV shows are ending up with like copious amounts of rewrites, and the final product ends up being this Frankenstein stitched together mess of like a bajillion different ideas, and it's like, what is even happening anymore? James Gunn states that the only thing that will make fans like these movies anymore is a goddamn miracle. But Rick is like, nah, you know what this next movie needs? It needs us. It needs Rick and Morty. So Rick yoinks the script, they portal out, they leave Jerry behind, roll the intro credits, please. Turns out Rick was quite busy during the opening credits as he invented a machine that literally writes and generates movies. Talk about a literal plot device. So Rick prompts the machine to make the comic relief character Tannenbaum to kill the main antagonist. And as a result, Tannenbaum gets tried for murder and ends up in prison. Also, I think if I have done my research correctly, Tannenbaum means like fir tree or pine tree in German. Jerry gives his 2 cents and questions if these narrative changes are even good narrative changes. But Rick and Morty aggressively clap back, saying that the stereotypical formulaic bullshit is the whole problem with the recent movies in this franchise. Rick states that they, Rick and Morty, are going to be the ones that make people care about these characters again. And just like that, the machine malfunctions and Rick and Morty end up inside the movie. Yup, we're also doing that trope on top of all this commentary about the film industry that we've been experiencing. So now with their lives in the hands of Jerry, yikes, Jerry gets the brilliant idea to spawn them a super cool getaway car.
Are you kidding me? This car sucks!
As they're driving, Rick determines that the only way for them to get out of the movie is for the movie to end, but due to their prior tweaks before they got sucked into the machine, there is now no antagonist and no third act. So now they have to Frankenstein a plot together in order to escape. And they literally Frankenstein the antagonist, Baron Thistle, back to life with a little bit of lightning. But he ends up being kind of like a zombie thing, and he bites Morty on the arm, and now Morty is the new antagonist, and he's also a cactus. I think they should have made Rick the antagonist, because then he could have been Prickle Rick. All they need now is a new third act, and it turns out the original third act for this movie was going to be the comic relief character getting killed in front of the main cast. Rick says how that actually would have been a pretty cool ending, which I think is also showcasing how overly aggressive and toxic fans tend to exhibit a degree of hypocrisy. The escape plan that the trio comes up with is simple. Morty, as the son of Thistle, will finish what his dad started, Rick will break Tannenbaum out of prison, and in the big climax of the film, Morty will be the one to kill Tannenbaum in front of the main cast, just like the original script planned. Bing bang boom, movie over, go home. Quite frankly, I think it could use a little bit of a polish work there, Rick, maybe add in a few more details, and I think you probably should.
See you in the third act!
Over to the Warner Bros. Studio, we see James Gunn getting some lunch when he's approached by none other than Zach Snyder himself. Snyder opens the conversation by saying how Gunn's Superman movie had too much conversation going on. You know, there weren't enough slow-mo punches and zoom-ins on the punches. How in the world did they get Snyder to say these lines that are essentially just mocking him? Gunn explains what Rick did in his office earlier, and Gunn asks himself and Snyder if they're losing touch with the audience. I think that's an actual genuine question that directors should ask themselves nowadays, but I don't think it's entirely on them, and we'll get to that a bit later. Turns out Snyder knew exactly who Rick was, and that he, quote, doesn't represent real fans, and can't do what they do, probably. But Snyder gets his creatine and heads to the gym, leaving Gunn with a look of spite on his face. Meanwhile, Morty connected with Baron Thistle's old henchmen, who actually have a pretty cool looking design. Kind of look like something out of Garden Warfare or something like that. Morty decides to go with the supportive boss approach, and starts to muck up plans for a doomsday device that will melt the ice caps. Rick, on the other hand, begins planning his prison break. Tannenbaum, in his low and just horrible state, declares that he sucks. You know, he's no good, he sucks. And Rick declares that,
Come on, everyone sucks until they don't. That's the arc of every good story.
damn, Rick, those are some pretty encouraging and very truthful words you just said. And as the badass prison break gets underway, James Gunn is plotting to steal the movie machine by preying on Jerry's stupidity by impersonating Beth over the phone. And after he gets rid of Jerry, James Gunn declares that no one in the world is more creative than him now that he has the movie machine. Oh, and he gives an evil laugh, just for good measure, you know? Rick gets Tannenbaum back to the Tree Force Robo Tree base. It doesn't matter, it's not important. All that matters is that Tannenbaum gave Rick one of his balls, and Morty is using social media to spread the word of his evil plan. The intended final climax initiates, and Rick and Morty finally meet back up. Rick expresses how Tannenbaum is kind of his favorite character now, and unsurprisingly, Morty snaps. He's a cactus, he's in pain, and he wants to go home. And Morty kind of gets like really into the whole villain thing.
Now listen to me, you stupid old man! You're gonna bring Tannenbaum here, and I'm gonna shoot him in the goddamn head just like we planned!
But unfortunately, our dynamic duo get caught in their little side plot, and now everyone is trying to kill them. In the real world, James Gunn is about to take off with the movie machine, but thankfully Jerry Ex Machina has appeared. And even though James Gunn's offer of like movie success and tons of money is very tempting, Jerry's traditional family values override that needs, and he punches James Gunn in the face. I didn't know seeing Jerry from Rick and Morty punch James Gunn in the face was something I needed in my life. And with the power of some encouraging words from Rick and Adderall, Jerry writes the end of the movie script. Rick and Morty both die in the movie after a pretty badass car chase, and once the movie ends, they're ejected from the machine. Rick reflects on this whole ordeal and is like, yeah, okay, making movies is actually kind of hard. And he comes to the conclusion that he'll just stick to what he knows best, being an impossible to please fan. Meanwhile, James Gunn has snatched the hard drive from the movie machine and he gives it over to the Warner Bros. James Gunn tells them that this hard drive could not only sell more movies and popcorn than ever, but it could give people hope again. And the Warner Brothers thank him for his service and relieve him of his duty. from life. Roll the end credits, editor. The commentary this episode of Rick and Morty gives about the modern film industry, its directors, its fans, its movies, are all very well captured if you ask me. I mean, hell, let's be honest with ourselves. Some of our favorite franchises have really been going down the shitter for the last couple of years now. And this episode of Rick and Morty brings up a lot of important factors and questions as to why that is. One of my personal favorites that this episode included, and what I think is one of the most major causes, is when James Gunn asked Snyder, are we losing touch with the audience? I think the corporate side of the film industry has lost whatever little amount of touch it had with the audience to begin with, and as a result, fans, toxic and non-toxic alike, are throwing out their disappointment and frustrations about how they're losing touch with them. However, since the corporate people aren't really the ones who get hit with all that stuff because, well, they're just too rich to be hit with any of that, all that heat sorta ends up getting put on the directors of the films. You know, the people actually writing the movies. With the fans accusing the directors of losing touch and the directors saying, are we losing touch with our audience? It devolves into this horrible feedback loop where the quality of the movies just gets lower and lower and lower. When something is blatantly and just flat out bad, we, the audience, should criticize it. We should give our opinions, but we should do it in a constructive manner if we want the follow-up films to actually improve. If the foundation of feedback that the directors have to work with is nothing but a bunch of Redditors screaming and yelling to do better next time, then the directors aren't really gonna have a whole lot to work with, now are they? Rick was the pure embodiment of the impossible to please fan in this episode. Constantly angry, saying he can do it way better than the current people can, and not being 100% fair to movies and not giving them a proper chance. Granted, when the movies in your favorite franchise have a 5-year track record of just sucking ass, then it's completely understandable when your passion and frustration just override your constructive logic. And I've been in that situation myself many times. Both sides of this coin are completely understandable and valid. What I think it ultimately comes down to is that the directors nor the fans want to admit that they're in the wrong when they're in the wrong. Because who wants to admit when they're wrong? No one. I think that is one of the primary, if not the primary root between this huge divide between the fans and the directors. And I think that Rick saying that he'll just stick to being an impossible to please fan is meant to be a sort of like mirror for us to look at. Do we really want to keep being these huge assholes and let our frustration control our criticism? And I think James Gunn getting shot at the very end of the episode is meant to be a representation of the sacrifices and difficult choices that the directors have to make beholden to the corporation. Seems like a bleak message to end things on, I know. But I think what this episode is just trying to show us overall is the insanity and ridiculousness on both sides of the modern day film industry. No one fan or director is to blame. There's fuck-ups all across the board, and we can keep making these fuck-ups, or we can try to be constructive and encourage others, be it directors or fans, to do the same. I gotta say, I really enjoyed this episode of Rick and Morty. As someone who loves the film industry and wants it to be this thriving, amazing, magical place again, I like seeing a show that I like bring attention to all these ridiculous and insane things that are happening in it as of late. Not to mention the last episode of Rick and Morty was kind of like, you know? Where this episode was well written and the commentary it gave was very intelligent, and it didn't feel condescending or patronizing. It felt like genuine, objective commentary about what's going on in the modern day film industry. And since I'm giving official, actual ratings now, I'm going to give this episode of Rick and Morty a very respectable 4 out of 5 stars. Well done. Well done. If you enjoyed this video and the episode itself, be sure to leave all thoughts and opinions down in the comments. And while you're down there, I'd greatly appreciate it if you would hit the like and sub button, especially if you want to see my thoughts on the rest of Rick and Morty Season 8. And if you really like the way I do things around here and you want to show me a little bit of extra support, then definitely consider becoming a channel member. Not only do you get access to a whole bunch of exclusive rewards, but you also directly support me in the process and help keep this channel running. Alright, well, I'm gonna go grab my drone and see if I can't recover James Gunn's corpse. I bet his finger bones will fetch a mighty fine price. Later.